An archetype, as defined by Merriam-Webster's dictionary, is the original pattern or model of which all things of the same type are representations or copies. While this is a generic enough definition to be applied to the word archetype used in the Yu-Gi-Oh community, a better way to understand what it means to duel monsters is simply a group of cards of which the members have some common thread in the card names and sometimes the effect text. Some perfect examples would be things like Hero, Cyber Dragon, Blackwing, Noble Knight, and so on. Unsurprisingly, cards sharing that common thread work quite well together, and often can have trouble with cards outside their archetype. So whereas the earliest days of Yu-Gi-Oh! Had us building decks that included the strongest cards without as much focus on theming and synergy, the modern day game looks quite different. Rather than ripping open a pack and grabbing a couple cards from it to include in our deck, we now talk about which archetypes we'd like to build next, with synergy being at the forefront of any deck building philosophy. But what happens when the synergy of pre-existing archetypes is disrupted? What would happen if suddenly an archetype's card pool was shrunk in half? Believe it or not, Duel Links has served as an excellent example of what archetypes would sink or swim if they lost some of their support, given that a number of available archetypes don't have their complete card pool. With all that in mind, welcome to Missing Links, an archetype review series with a twist. I'm going to be taking a look at the archetypes we have in Duel Links, their impact and popularity, then introducing the additional cards available to them in the TCG to discuss whether or not they'd make the archetype stronger, and if it's even possible for them to cross over into Duel Links. Missing Links begins with an archetype centered around one of Yu-Gi-Oh's most iconic monster cards, one that's still receiving support nearly 20 years later, Dark Magician. While I'm sure the Master of Magicians needs no real introduction, for archival purposes, Dark Magician is the first of many ace monsters that would serve as icons for the Yu-Gi-Oh franchise for years to come, and one of many aces that would have an archetype slowly built around them over the years. Dark Magician was wielded by the king of games, Yugi Muto, throughout the first generation of the Yu-Gi-Oh anime. Even during this initial run, there was a number of monsters, spells, and traps that synergized with him, but a full deck revolving around him wouldn't truly be available for years to come, despite his inclusion in some early playground meta strategies. In Duel Links, Dark Magician recently just ended a stint as one of the most powerful decks in the game, at least relative to the release of this video. The deck's been receiving core cards since the release of the game, but it wasn't until mid to late 2019 that some of its most powerful back row support was revealed, with its most prominent period of high-level play being a large part of 2020. Let's examine some of the cards that were central to the strategy in Duel Links before we jump into cards that have yet to reach the game. In the format where Dark Magician was played heavily, a large portion of the most dominant decks were control decks, things like Goki, Shiranui, Invoked, and so on. Dark Magician gave itself the edge against these control-oriented strategies by being able to consistently swarm the field quickly with large monsters, along with banishing cards even during your opponent's turn. It was fast enough to overwhelm those decks, but not quite strong enough to withstand more aggressive decks like Heroes and Blackwings, but Dark Magician was given an extensive amount of play during its reign of terror. By himself, Dark Magician is far from anything worth writing home about. As a 2-tribute monster resulting in a 2500 attack beat stick, he's beaten out in almost every way by the rival Seto Kaiba's ace monster, Blue Eyes White Dragon. Because of that, he's supported by a parade of spells and traps that make him incredibly easy and consistent to summon. There's pretty much zero reason to run any less than 3 copies of him. The most common opening play for this archetype is the continuous spell card Dark Magical Circle, released in Future Horizon just at the end of 2019. When activated, you search the top 3 cards of your deck for a Dark Magician or a spell or trap that specifically lists Dark Magician and add it to your hand. This helps the deck set itself up for success incredibly quickly, as it allows you to fill in any gaps in your hand. On top of that, it allows you to banish one of your opponent's cards when you summon Dark Magician, giving you the ability to snipe critical targets from your opponent's field just for summoning your main monster. It's hard to overstate the importance of a card like this, especially considering that Circle's Banish could activate even if you summon Dark Magician during your opponent's turn. This gave the deck the ability to put a great amount of pressure on the opposition quickly, granting you bonuses for swarming the field by either clearing your opponents or disrupting their plays. The biggest downside to this card was its hard once per turn, meaning that if it was shut down by the litany of spell and trap removal we have now, you'd be locked out of it. The other perceived downside, the requirement of actually summoning Dark Magician, was easily fixed with this next card. Magician Navigation, a trap card released during the summer of 2019, was the engine that could turbo your Dark Magicians onto the board. When activated, you special summon a Dark Magician from your hand, then grab a level 7 or lower spellcaster from your deck and summon that too. Additionally, as long as you're in control of a Dark Magician, you can banish it from the graveyard to negate a spell or trap on the other side of the field. And, on top of all that, given that this was a trap card, it allowed you to use Circle's banish effect on your opponent's turn. Navigation was a powerful enough part of the deck to require a limit 3 being placed on it when Konami was trying to nerf the deck, which severely hindered the consistency of its central strategy. With these 3 cards, we start to see an ideal opening turn for the deck. Activate Circle, search 3, and add Dark Magician or Navigation to your hand. Set Navigation, pass, and wait for the opportunity to activate Navigation, giving you a chance to summon Dark Magician from your hand. But, as we just learned, Navigation lets you summon a second spellcaster monster. So who's the best choice for the job? I would say that the most common target for Navigation is Magician of Dark Illusion, which I suppose you could say is a retrain of the Dark Magician himself. His stats are reversed, and his name becomes Dark Magician once he hits the field. If you activate a spell or trap while he's face up on your side of the board, you can actually summon a Dark Magician from the grave. So even if your opponent has a way to deal with him, you can always get him back and continue swarming the field. However, he's incredibly versatile, as he can be special summoned both if he's in your deck, or even in your hand, as long as it's your opponent's turn. His first effect says that if it's your opponent's turn when you activate a spell or trap, you can drop him onto the field from your hand, giving an even greater boost to this deck's swarm potential. This was another card that was so important to the central strategy of the deck that he needed to be limited down to 2 copies. Previously, I mentioned the consistency of the deck being a part of why it was so successful, but if you weren't around during Dark Magician's period of dominance, it may be a bit difficult to see how the deck could avoid bricking. That's where Magician's Rod comes into play. When you normal summon it, you can grab a spell or trap that lists Dark Magician on it from your deck, and if you activate a spell or trap while it's in the graveyard, you can put it back into your hand by sacrificing a spellcaster monster. This was the card you used to unbrick yourself if you were missing one of the all-important back row cards, or grabbed something extra to keep up the pressure. If you've already got the spells and traps you need, but you're missing a Dark Magician in hand, then Illusion Magic may be a better rod target for you. Unfortunately, there's only 1 copy available in Duel Links, but even at 1, it can still be useful. It's a quick play spell that allows you to tribute a spellcaster monster to add 2 copies of Dark Magician from your deck to your hand. So you could easily summon Rod, search for Illusion Magic, then tribute the Rod to grab copies of Dark Magician. It's just another way the deck works to keep itself consistent, and one of the many reasons it was so deadly just this past year. Another great thing about the Dark Magician archetype is how it leaves itself some breathing room for additional cards to bolster its strategy, prepare for bad matchups, and so on. While there are a variety of staple cards that could easily work their way into this deck, as this is a video focused on the Dark Magician archetype, I'll only be covering Dark Magician adjacent tech cards in this section, so things like Cosmic Cyclone, Karma Cut, and so on won't be covered. First up, considering that 2500 attack isn't quite enough to get over some troublesome boss monsters, some Dark Magician decks opt for using Fusion to out some particularly strong monsters. That means the Eye of Timaeus actually sees some solid play here. It's basically a polymerization that lets you bypass the need to run a second Fusion material monster in your deck. You can target a Dark Magician you control, then summon a Fusion monster that specifically lists it as Fusion material. In other words, this card almost magically transforms your Dark Magician into a Fusion monster. Probably the best option to summon from Eye of Timaeus would be Dark Cavalry. With a base 2800 attack body that grows by 100 attack for every spell and trap on the field and in both graves, it's a solid way to out some incredibly tough boss monsters. And since you're playing a Dark Magician deck, it's more than likely that you alone will have enough spells and traps to make this play worthwhile. Add in piercing battle damage and the ability to negate cards that target one of your cards with a single discard, and you've got yourself a solid way to combat big monsters. Timaeus also opens the door for some other more outlandish fusion plays, like Dark Paladin and Amulet Dragon. They're both fairly situational and almost entirely dependent on your matchup. Dark Paladin grows for every dragon on the field and in the grave, so it's a great card to use against something like Blue Eyes, while Amulet Dragon's ability to banish spells would make it decent against something like a Witchcrafter deck. Again, these aren't must-haves, but are definitely solid choices for the extra deck, at least prior to the Xyz era when the deck was most heavily played. In addition to a fusion-centric deck, it's also entirely possible to pivot into something based around the ritual monster Magician of Chaos. Its name becomes Dark Magician once it hits the field, so Dark Magical Circle activates on its summon, and you can destroy something once a turn whenever a spell or trap is activated. That actually includes your own circle and navigation, so it synergizes quite well with the strategy you're already using in the deck. This monster would probably best fit with a deck using the Master of Rites skill, but you could also use Chaos Form as the ritual spell, which can be searched by Magician's Rod. For my free-to-play players out there, the Dark Magician archetype has an excellent back row removal card in Dark Magic Attack, which destroys all of your opponent's spells and traps as long as you've got Dark Magician on the field. Sadly, it's only a normal spell, so it's not something you can spring as a surprise on your opponent. And ultimately, it's going to be a bit redundant since navigation could just negate those back row instead, but it's worth mentioning as a solid free choice. Another somewhat situational free card is Dark Magic Curtain, a normal spell that cuts your life in half to special summon a Dark Magician straight from your deck. This is a great choice if you're using a skill like Titan Showdown, Sealed Tombs, or See You Later, as it not only allows all those skills to come into play immediately, but it may be the single best way to trigger Dark Magical Circle on the same turn you activate it. If you missed out on the event that gave extra copies of this card, even a single copy is still good, but otherwise, maybe stick to 2 on this one. One of my personal favorite techs in the archetype is Dark Magic Expanded, an incredibly versatile quick play spell with a whole host of effects, all dependent on how many Dark Magician and Dark Magician Girl cards you've got on the field or in the grave. If you've only got one, then one of your Dark Spellcasters gains 1000 attack. If you've got 2, your opponent loses the ability to respond to your spells and traps on that turn. And if you've got 3, all your Dark Spellcasters become immune to your opponent's card effects for the turn. It's got a whole host of situations where it can be used, far too many to list in this video, but it's a Swiss Army knife of great defensive effects that can come in handy in a pinch. As previously alluded to, Dark Magician had an incredibly strong impact on the metagame once all the pieces were in place. It was a powerful deck featured heavily in both the ranked ladder and tournament play, and drew ire from duelists of all walks of life at its strongest point. Some have even likened the hate levied against Dark Magician to that of Blue Eyes in the current year, 2021. The archetype received the heaviest blow to its viability on the somewhat infamous December 2020 ban list, which hit a number of incredibly powerful decks like Invoked, Shiranui, Crystron, Karakuri, and of course, Dark Magician. Magician of Dark Illusion was limited to 2 copies, while Magician Navigation was limited to 3. Magician's Rod was actually moved from a limit 2 to 3, but overall, this was what hampered the popularity and strength of the deck so much. Deck lists of the previously full-power Dark Magician archetype looked quite different from what we have now, with the game fully transitioning into the era of Xyz summoning during its fall from grace. In more recent months, the Star Seraph engine has been featured as part of a new version of the deck, and the newly added Mecha Phantom Beast Draco Sack has been mixed into the extra deck. But overall, the deck has mostly fallen out of its place at the top. However, Dark Magician has a whole rogues gallery of additional support cards in the TCG that we've yet to see in Duel Links. Cards I fully believe could propel the deck back onto the tier list and into the spotlight. We'll transition away from Duel Links to take a quick look at the TCG and reveal the missing links that could bring Dark Magician back from the brink. Recently reprinted in the TCG's Ghost from the Past set as a beautiful Ghost Rare card, Dark Magician's strategies in the card game seem to be somewhat similar to that of Duel Links. It excels at searching for exactly what it needs, and has a surprising amount of card draw to boot. Same as before, I won't be covering staple cards here, because of course, Ash Blossom would fit perfectly into a Dark Magician deck. Instead, it's all about Dark Magician specific cards, many of which come from the legendary duelist booster Magical Hero. Not all of these cards would be necessary to bring the archetype back to its former glory, but even just a couple could give the deck a massive power boost. Let's start off with Apprentice Illusion Magician, which gives off the appearance of a Dark Magician Girl retrain, with the same stats and a similar art style. Though it's level 6, it can easily be special summoned by discarding a card, and when you summon it, you can actually grab a Dark Magician from your deck. It also has a nice combat trick, allowing you to discard it from your hand or the field when a Dark Spellcaster does battle with a monster to give it a quick 2000 attack boost. Think of this card almost like a Dark Magician proxy. You can get a 2k monster out on turn 1, and be ready to activate navigation with a freshly searched Dark Magician in hand, all without using your normal summon. I think it's fairly easy to argue that this would see almost immediate play in Duel Links if it were released today, but within Dark Magician, this card is just another piece of the puzzle, another way to fix up your hand with whatever you're missing after the draw. Though it was released as a super rare in the TCG, it almost feels like it would need to be released as an ultra rare, as it's got a crazy amount of potential. I could almost see this card having a unique problem in the speed duel format because of its attack boost effect. While a plus 2000 may not seem like a crazy amount in the TCG, that's nearly half of your opponent's total life. Sticking with the theme of missing effect monsters, next up is the roughly $100 ultra rare Magician's Souls. This card made waves across social media upon its release, and it's very likely you're aware of it even if you've never played the TCG. It's another versatile card with a number of effects. If it's on the board, you can throw away up to 2 spells and/or traps to draw that many cards. If it's in your hand, you can toss a level 6 or higher spellcaster from your deck to the grave to either special summon it or send it to the grave to summon a Dark Magician or Dark Magician Girl from the same place. Of course, I don't feel like I have to go too in-depth as to why this card's so darn strong, especially in the speed duel format where drawing a couple cards from a 20-card deck can completely turn the tide of the duel. I'd be willing to bet just about any amount of money that this card would be printed as an ultra rare in Duel Links as well, if not a selection box you are. The ability to pitch cards you don't need just to gas up is just plain great, and being another way to flood your board with Dark Magicians is just fantastic. This may very well never come to the game, to be completely honest. Next up, we've got a quick play ultra rare spell in Soul Servant, a card that almost quite literally lets you stack your deck and draw into the cards you stack. When it's activated, you can place a card that's either Dark Magician, or one that specifically lists him or Dark Magician Girl on top of your deck from either your hand, deck, or graveyard. Then, during your main phase, if you banish it from grave, you can draw cards equal to all Palladium, Dark Magician, and Dark Magician Girl monsters with different names on the field and in the graves. Again, this is another card that gives the Archetype access to 2 incredibly powerful things, card draw and search. Of course, tools like this are highly valued in the TCG, but they become even more treasured in a format where the decks are cut in half. This is another card I worry would be too strong for Duel Links, and above and beyond anything we've got in the current game. This would give Dark Magician draw power similar to Blue Eyes, at least in my view, and I'm sure you're all really big fans of more Blue Eyes-like decks. Next up, we've essentially got somewhat of an upgrade to the Eye of Timaeus in Secrets of Dark Magic, a quick play spell that combines the effects of Polymerization and Chaos Form into one. Unfortunately, you can only choose between one of its effects, being to fusion summon something involving Dark Magician or Dark Magician Girl, or to use them as part of a ritual summon. With the smaller deck size leaving us with less room for multiple strategies, I don't necessarily think this card would be the most broken, and I don't know if I find it particularly powerful. This is one of the cards that I don't find to be entirely necessary to power up the Archetype, but it's worth mentioning as it's cool to see a card combine fusion and ritual summoning. Despite the capability of the deck to swarm the field, it dies far too quickly to stuff like Lightning Vortex, or really any other removal. You've only got so many navigations after all. That's where the continuous trap, Eternal Soul, comes to the rescue. At the risk of being forced to wipe your board upon its removal, it makes every Dark Magician you've got immune to your opponent's card effects. It also lets you special summon a Dark Magician from your hand or grave, and also dig for a Dark Magic attack or Thousand Knives. I think this card is a must-have when discussing missing archetypal support for Dark Magician, and there's no question that it would be somewhat powerful. Although, with the amount of back row removal, it probably wouldn't last long. But I think even just flipping it to defend yourself for a turn, or even from a single card, is good enough to warrant this card being a solid inclusion. If navigation doesn't provide enough negation for your liking, then maybe the continuous trap Magician's Combination is for you. Once per turn, when a card or effect is activated outside of the damage step, you can tribute a Dark Magician or Dark Magician Girl to special summon one from your hand or grave, then negate the effect in question. It also lets you destroy a card whenever it's sent to the grave. This card does feel a bit out of place when it's side by side with all the other missing support, but I find Combination to be a solid entry that sort of balances the archetype out. Aside from navigation, it feels like Dark Magician is sort of at the mercy of its opponents, obviously not accounting for staples you might include in your own deck. Fortunately, this patches up that weaker spot in the archetype. Winding down with extra deck monsters now, let's take a look at a card that I realistically feel could come very soon, Ebon Illusion Magician. It's a rank 7 Xyz that can be summoned by placing it on top of a rank 6 spellcaster or with 2 level 7 monsters. You can detach one to special summon a spellcaster normal monster from your hand or deck, and when one of your spellcaster normal monsters declares an attack, you can banish one of your opponent's cards. I'm far from an expert in making assumptions about balancing, but I'd say I could see this card in the game, even in its current state. There's enough removal in the game to handle this monster, and since its name doesn't change to Dark Magician, it's much harder to protect. Besides, with the Star Seraph engine currently being included in Dark Magician decks, the Archetype has already made the jump to the Xyz era, and this could be a nice boost. The final card I want to touch on is one of my personal favorites, the fusion monster known as the Dark Magicians. Dark Magician and Dark Magician Girl join forces for this fusion monster. Once per turn, if a spell or trap is activated outside the damage step, you can draw a card. If it's a spell or trap, you can set it. And finally, if it's a trap or a quick play spell, you can use it right away. Also, when this card is destroyed, you can summon a Dark Magician and Dark Magician Girl from anywhere you like. If Konami wants to center a box around a revival of the Dark Magician archetype in Duel Links, this would most definitely serve as the cover card. It's a pretty strong monster that's fairly easy to summon, with an effect that could be pretty insane. Imagine being able to activate a trap right away, simply because your opponent's trying to make their plays. You could even use it in response to your own spells and traps, which is the best kind of play in my humble opinion. So, to wrap up this discussion of TCG cards we don't have access to yet, what's making the cut and what isn't? The way I see it, the cards that are probably safest to add would be things like Eternal Soul, Magician's Combination, Ebon Illusion Magician, and the Dark Magicians. My reasoning for this is because I think it would be safer to keep the archetype focused on cheating Dark Magician into play, rather than adding several new card draw options, given that we're talking about 20 card decks. If they want to add some draw power, I think it would be wise to only include either Magician's Souls or Soul Servant. Including both could easily spiral the deck into more card draw than Blue Eyes, on top of the Search and Swarm the archetype already has access to. Regarding Apprentice Illusion Magician, while we have cards that behave similarly like Bujingi Crane, I feel like her versatility on top of the Crane-like combat trick makes her less likely to get added to the game. I'd also say that Secrets of Dark Magic is a safe inclusion, and it could probably even be dropped in rarity. Maybe I'm overlooking something, but I don't see it being a particularly destructive card in the speed duel format. And hey, speaking of overlooking something, feel free to tell me what I missed in this analysis in the comments section down below. I'd love to chat with you about how to power up this iconic archetype without completely overtuning it. And that's where I'll wrap up this first entry in the Missing Links series. It's not surprising there's so many incomplete archetypes in Duel Links, as the game is somewhat like living in a 2012 meta time capsule at the moment, and Konami has to consider what cards are fair to include in that time frame. But it's always fun to see what hasn't made the jump yet, and what sort of cards we can look forward to in the future. For now, I've been Diatonic, roll outro. Hey everyone, thank you so much for watching. Your support means a ton, and if you'd like to support me even more, it'd be great if you left a like and comment on this video, as well as smacking that subscribe button so you know when the next video is ready for you. Also, I'm live 4 days a week over at my Twitch channel with plenty of Duel Links content. I've always got an open duel room for you, and I even run a tournament every Saturday where you can win a free sub to the channel, so feel free to stop on by, we'd love to have you. Who knows, you might even be featured in my next video. As always, I hope you have a great day. I've been Diatonic, signing off.